Okay, so I will talk very briefly today because standards are the most interesting thing ever imaginable about open annotation, which is some research funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, to whom we are, of course, extremely grateful. Sorry. So scholarly communication, and indeed all communication, is increasingly online, open, distributed, and collaborative. Annotation is communication, so we need to be sure that digital annotations fall under these categories. There are many readers that want to share their experience of reading, and there was a great quote yesterday about how if a book was streamed, the only thing that a reader would own would be their experience and how that was captured by their annotations. But even, and there was some potential disagreement with the ubiquity of that this morning, but even if they don't want to share their annotations with others, they certainly want to share their annotations with themselves across platforms, across devices, across editions of books, and so on and so forth. So this led to the open annotation collaboration being formed, and our focus is on the interoperable sharing of annotations, and sharing potentially being with yourself. So we have a web-centric approach. It's very open. We're trying to escape the lockdown Facebook silos where you create your annotations on things and they are stuck there. So we want to be able to create annotations, consume them, and interact with them in different environments and with different services that add value over top of them. We've defined a model which starts off very simple for simple cases and builds, hopefully linearly in complexity with the complexity of the use case. You'll be pleased to know that there will be no lots of skittles and lines between skittles diagrams in this talk. So the collaboration is Los Alamos National Lab, where I'm a research scientist, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the University of Queensland in Australia, the University of Maryland, George Mason University, and many other adopters, partners, and supporters. Our design guidelines, then, we've based everything that we do on the architecture of the World Wide Web as the human communication system. And on linked open data whenever possible. It should be general enough for ease of adoption, but rich enough to cover interesting use cases. Our current status, we've just released a beta version after 18 months of initial alpha, and we have 9 funded experiments around the world to investigate the use of the beta version in order to inform the version 1.0, which we hope to have mid to end of next year. So some of those experiments, there's emblem books in Germany, and how do you annotate the concept that the emblem is describing versus the text versus the image. Modern Australian literature, automated annotation via text mining of bioinformatic literature, medieval manuscript facsimiles, which Ben Alberton and I are going to talk about tomorrow. So, unique, I think, in this thing in not being the first Antipodean accent that you've heard, thanks to Craig, and not going to be at a non-medieval conference the first medieval manuscript images that you'll see tomorrow. So, I'm astounded. Anyway, I digress. 17th century Dutch letters that were captured by pirates. So I am the first person to talk about pirates. Video annotation, etc., etc., etc. So I just wanted to end with a thought that we've run into time and time again during the open annotation work, that the hardest part is to define what annotation is. Is highlighting an annotation? If so, what is the comment? Is a bookmark an annotation? Maybe, maybe not. So This is where we've run into all sorts of scoping issues and difficulties. The one point that we could all agree on was that aboutness was key to distinguish it from general metadata, that there must be some resource that describes or is somehow about one or more other resources or parts of those resources. So during the talk tomorrow about shared canvas, we'll briefly describe the data model, so I will definitely not go into it now. Or in the meantime, if you're super keen, you can go to openannotation.org. Okay. We'll leave questions, if there are any, until the end of all of the 3 presentations, if that's okay. Thank you.
All right. So nothing more exciting than talking about how to develop a standard as an entrant into the afternoon. A little bit more about NISOs. NISO is the National Information Standards Organization. We're a membership-based organization that develops information standards for the publishing, library, and information distribution communities. I had put these slides together before Bob Stein talked about social reading, so I'm going to skip over some of this. But really, the experience of reading is a social activity. I think we've spent a lot of time talking about that today. There's a myth of the person sitting in a corner quietly reading. There is actually a much more lively experience that takes place before you get a book, after you get a book, after you've read a book, during the reading experience that is more akin to this. We have book clubs, we have classrooms, we have a variety of experiences where we might want to share what we're reading. This is a quote from Clive Thompson about that came from his article, The Future of the Reading in a Digital World, from about 2008, I think it was, where he talks about allowing the readers to be unleashed through social reading and social experience of digital texts. So what we as an organization wanted to do with the help of and leadership of Peter Brantley, organized a number of planning meetings to discuss how we might go about developing standards for annotation of digital texts and the sharing of those annotations. We held 3 meetings, the first in May at the Book Expo conference at NYU. A couple weeks ago at the Frankfurt Book Fair, we held another meeting, and again, as Peter mentioned, just yesterday. So we've probably spent, I don't know, 24, 30-some hours hashing over some of these issues. Again, as Peter mentioned, these meetings were funded through the kind support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and some of the things that we discussed. So what are the critical components of an annotation sharing environment that we can standardize, which is different from the user experience and the features that, say, different products or services might engender? So what are those critical components? The first is obviously architecture. The Open Annotation Collaboration has done a fair bit of work on this, developing a conceptual model for how to exchange annotations. The question that we have to do is vet that on a larger scale beyond some of the prototypes that the OAC has developed. The next big question that we've tried to work into is the syntax of how you point to where the annotation lies within a digital text. You know, page 217 doesn't mean anything in a reflowable environment. Now, if you think about a book that is strictly straight text, again, this is not such a difficult a matter to find that pointer. But if you think about how texts are constantly changing, edited between versions, this location problem becomes kind of difficult. What happens when a chapter or a paragraph is redacted between editions? One of the things that was mentioned yesterday is Mitt Romney's book, where he talked about the fantastic nature, how well the healthcare system in Massachusetts was working. That was in the first edition. In the second edition, that was gone. So if you have, if you're using something like a character count, and say from the text to X thousandth character, what happens when that paragraph's gone? You've just shot your character count. So we spent a great deal of time yesterday talking about this issue. It turns out that this is probably one of the more vexing challenges, and probably one of the things that we will attempt first to standardize and develop a syntax for. And the consensus seemed to be yesterday that we'll have to focus on some sort of heuristic or triangulation of several different methods for locating that annotation. So once you've got that annotation, we also want to share that. And how do we move that around? How do we package it? So there's a variety of issues there. In particular, one of the most difficult challenges is there are a variety of manifestations of a work, different editions. If you think of Mark Twain, that might have changed over time, and you have someone reading one version, one edition of a book on one reading device. How do you link that to another edition on another reading device? And how do you adjust for those possible changes, say in different versions of Hamlet, for example? So what are some of the difficulties and challenges in this experience, in this reading environment? In all likelihood, we probably don't want to share annotations with the entire world. So how do you limit the sharing that might take place in, say, a classroom environment? How do I only deal with the sharing of, say, my friends? I mean, this is something that anybody who's spent any time thinking about what Facebook is doing has experienced. So how does this work in an annotation environment? This probably, at least out of the conversations yesterday, this probably will punt on this question, but it certainly is a difficult challenge. The other issue is cascading. So this person says something about a text, and then someone comments on that text, on that comment, and comment, etc., and say cascade through. What happens if someone wants to delete their comment? How do you reference back when that secondary comment or tertiary comment disappears? And how do we deal with that? What sort of linking is necessary? What do we do when we want to reference several objects, several chapters, several different books? This is also another big challenge that we're going to have to deal with eventually. Another issue is cross-media applications. Especially as Bill McCoy talked about this morning, EPUB is going to be increasingly more multimedia. You might want to reference not just the text, but the audio or the video. So there's pretty big questions in terms of, well, it's easy to cite a character, but where do you cite the section in an audio stream? We note that the W3C has done some work in this and has initiated some work in this, and we're looking forward to reaching out to the W3C and partnering possibly on this work, because this is probably larger than just the publishing world. And we were also thinking about the challenges of mission creep. If we start, say, narrowly scoping this work and narrowly scoping it on the publishing industry or the ebook world, that's probably going to be easier to accomplish, but it's short-sighted in the idea that eventually books will become, or EPUB or content distribution will be much more multimedia. So again, if we are going to do that, we also need to reach out to, say, the recording industry and the audiovisual industry and the Motion Picture Association and get them involved. YouTube, etc. Flickr. They have a very robust commenting structure. How well do we want to integrate those two approaches? A general theme about standards. This is kind of a representation of the environment that we're trying to create, where one person is reading it on their computer or their device, and that device is connected to the rest of the community. And what we're interested in are the kind of lines, basically, the plumbing, that is really not very sexy, but it's critical in order to make all of this system work. You all, I'm sure, are not, there might be a few electrical engineers in here, but we all plugged our computers into the power plugs. And that's what we really need to focus on, and that's where we try and do our greatest work. So this has been launched as a NISO project. It was approved by the NISO voting members about 2 weeks ago. We are in the process of announcing that work, and we are working towards forming a working group to undertake this work. The goal is to have that working group in place, probably say a dozen or maybe 24 people, to really get into the nitty-gritty details of this and do the enjoyable life experience that is standards development work. We expect that group will probably form and begin its work in January. I'm going to really try and push them to see if we can get something done in 6 to 9 months to come up with at least the syntax for locating the text. And hopefully by, say, next summer or thereabouts, maybe next fall, have a specification that we can put out into the community as a draft standard for trial use. We then test that. We have a period of maybe 3 to 6 months to test that out in the community, kick the tires, if you will, get some comments back, and then, hopefully roll out a specification sometime in, say, 2013, around that time. And if you think about how well we're doing, especially from the perspective of standards development, used to be standards would take 5, 10, 15 years. We are trying desperately to get away from that. And we would rather release a specification that addresses one core issue and do it quickly than try and boil the ocean. And this is probably why we won't focus on, necessarily at the outset on all of the potential applications of annotation sharing, but knowing that we will reach out afterwards and move that forward. So this is a quote on Max Slocum's blog. He interviewed a number of people right after the iPad came out. And actually, during the discussions today and on the Twitter backstream, during some of the presentations related to, and social reading. There are different applications at different times. People have different interests at different times. And so this gets to the point of you might want to switch these services on and off. The problem is we have lots of switches in our world. We have lots of switches in our lives. How do we come to some consensus about what that switch should look like? And what's the back end that makes the systems work? And I think it was, is it Josh Pearson, Joe Pearson? Joe, I believe, was talking about the challenges of EPUB not being perfect. Well, this is this problem that we get into. If we try and find the perfect solution, we're not going to find the perfect solution. It's not going to work in every use case. If we can get it to work in 80% of the use cases, that's a great success. And we will definitely want to avoid this situation where there is just another annotation solution. So that's my contact information. If anyone is interested in participating in this work, as I said, we'll start work in January. Please email me or nisohq@niso.org, and we'd love to have your involvement and engagement. We're going to turn mirroring on.
Yes, that would be good.
And there,
Sweet.
you're now up.
Cool.
All right.
Hi, I'm James Bridle. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk briefly about my take on some of that annotation stuff. I was there at the NISO meeting yesterday, and I've been sort of following some of it from afar for a while, largely because of this project, which I started thinking about kind of early last year and first announced kind of version 1 of it at Frankfurt last year. And it's gone through quite a few changes on the way, largely because I'm stupid. It started with the fact that we need to cross that very large river, which is Amazon, and do better things. I come from a world where, like, the things that I use and love, which include books, are becoming more like other things I love, like the internet. But we're not allowed to do the same things with them. That's one of the major critical things. I'm used to building things on Twitter and other applications to make them into the things that I want them to be. You can't yet do that with books, and you particularly can't do them with the books that most people are reading, which are Kindle and a couple of other ones. They're not open, essentially. So what we did was start looking at what needs to happen. This also came out of a whole lot of other thinking about bookmarking and what ebooks really mean to us, which is something I'll probably speak a bit more about tomorrow. Where it came from was thinking a long time about this, about what we just heard about what is a bookmark, what is an annotation, what's the requirement for it. And essentially it's a pointer with a field attached to it that may or may not have something in it. There's lots of edge cases, obviously, but essentially that's it. That's a bookmark or an annotation or a note or whatever it is. And I was like, how hard can that be? You know? So I started talking about bookmarks as we need to build this thing. Can we all get together and build this thing? That would be great. And I started talking about, and lots of other people came up, and that was great. And then I was like, oh, right, standards are hard. And they're not hard just because they're hard to figure out, but there's a whole process around them of people who understand how to take a group consensus project through something like this. And I kind of realized I'd done that thing that I tend to hate on tech people for doing, which is sort of looking at a big industry like publishing and saying, oh, we can solve that. Well, I was kind of doing it from the other direction. I realized that was wrong. So what happened was did a kind of 90-degree pivot and took open bookmarks in a slightly different direction. And this is kind of version 2, which is talking a lot more in a more public, reader-facing way about what social reading is and what it can be and how we can get to the point where it's really good, because it's really important that we do that. So open bookmarks at the moment exists as something to educate publishers, readers, and to some extent technologists working around publishing services about what we want from social reading and what it is, and trying to come up with definitions of it. And I think what we want is quite important. So I've been slowly trying to kind of formulate this checklist. Instead of trying to do the tech stuff, which we have organizations of very highly skilled people are going to do that, it's more about defining what the space and what this thing should achieve and why that's important. So for readers, they should be thinking about these issues because they're important to their reading. They should know that when they get an e-reader, that they should have the ability to bookmark and annotate in it. That it's not this dumb object, that it's like a paper book. You can underline it, you can dog ear, you can get involved in this. Because that's the thing that's been stopping ebook adoption in a huge way, I think. It's a huge barrier to people's adoption of these things. Even if people aren't entirely aware of it, they sense there's something wrong with the things we're building. You should be able to share these things because that's a natural part of something being digitized and networked. And also there are caveats as well. Your reading should be private and personal if you want it to be. Those controls need to be built into the tools we build. And readers need to know about these things and they need to demand them. Publishers need to think about this stuff as well because we want people to adopt ebooks, we want them to read more, and so we need to give them the kind of things they want. So the open bookmarks idea includes things like interoperable formats, open formats, non-restrictive DRM. I understand the arguments for DRM, I'm hugely sympathetic for them, but not when they stop people reading. An ebook should allow text selection, quoting, and bookmarking. There's this huge kind of argument fight coming when publishers and copyright holders notice that we're highlighting in their books and we don't know what that means. If it allows someone to completely reconstitute the text elsewhere, when people notice that, they're going to get very upset. So we need to start thinking about what that means for the books, and we need to talk to publishers about it. Developers as well need to understand that readers have rights in this situation, that when you're building tools for the readers need to be able to do things with the text they're building. And that includes things like exporting and archiving, which I'll come back to in just a sec. These are really important parts of the thing. So part of this is about raising awareness of what social reading could be in order that closed systems start to adopt more open practices that will benefit us all. And that will only happen if readers and publishers and service providers all understand what the benefits of this stuff can be and approach the people who are not being open about it and start to demand these things. This will happen from the bottom up, essentially. And also at the same time, we can work with standards organizations who will top down, give us the tools to implement this. And this is the kind of stuff that makes what NISA is doing really, really exciting. And I just want to finish by briefly saying what it is actually about social reading that's really exciting. Because social reading is hugely more than just annotations and bookmarking. What those practices enable are huge. There was a lot of back chatter in the Twitter channel about social book and about this fear of the kind of the cacophony within the page, that this might be slightly damaging and distracting, which sounds a lot like my dad talking about Facebook, and it sounds a lot like my friends who don't use Twitter talking about Twitter. They're kind of scared of this noise. The noise is not the issue here. The silence is the issue, essentially, and that's what we have to kind of break through and talk about. But there's also, like, social reading is easily misconstrued as something that just breaks open the book, that breaks it apart, brings in all these other voices, and makes it more confusing and harder. For me, actually, a huge part of social reading is what it enables for individuals. In fact, for me, it's the most important part. There's things that you can do with social reading that you can't do otherwise. If you look back at the history of social services, things like Delicious is a really good example of this. Delicious is an incredibly powerful service, bookmarking service, because it allowed people to share their bookmarks, but as it did, it provided them with this incredibly rich archive for themselves. It's what's termed selfishly social. What open bookmarks, what the sharing of annotations and what social reading allows is your own personal record of this stuff. Because we're entering a period when the books are not what we used to think they are. They don't belong to us in the same way. We won't hold on to them in the same way. But what we will retain is our kind of entire experience of the book and what those books mean to us, and we will do that through the interactions we have with them. And if we allow those things to belong to large corporations, we're going to really regret that quite soon. And if we put them all into a single service, however wonderful that service is, they're not going to last. So it's incredibly important that we recognize that these social functions enable things that are going to be incredibly important to us in the future. And that's why I urge you to vote open bookmarks and to support organizations like NISO who are doing this and to explore the social reading situation in whatever way it comes along because it's going to be very exciting. Thank you very much.